Pablo Escobar is widely known in the Western world as the King of Cocaine, but he was also known to many in Colombia by another nickname, El Robin Hood Paisa. Founder of the Colombian drug cartel named the Medellín Cartel, Escobar left behind a controversial legacy following his demise in 1993, just one day after his 44th birthday. At the time of his death, he is estimated to have been worth around $6.4 billion in today's money, making him the wealthiest criminal of all time. And while he was corrupt, murderous, and the perpetrator of countless crimes, he was also respected by many as he would use his money to build housing for the poor, donate to charity, and sponsor local events and sports teams. But who exactly was the King of Cocaine, and what drew him to a life of crime? We aim to answer these questions and more as we take a deep dive into the life and crimes of Pablo Escobar. Early life. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born December 1st, 1949 in Rio Negro, Colombia. He was third of 7 children born to a poor farmer, Abel de Jesus Dari Escobar Echeverri, and his wife, Hermilda de los Dolores Gaviria Berrio. Following Abel and Hermilda's marriage, the couple decided it would be best for Hermilda, a school teacher, to quit her job and begin staying at home to look after the children, as was customary at the time. However, after having 2 children, Roberto and Pablo, it became clear that Abel's income was not enough to sustain the family. Abel soon took a job with a neighbor, a prominent political figure named Joaquin Vallejo Arbeláez, who needed somebody to run his estate. Joaquin and his wife became close with Abel and Hermilda. He insisted that Hermilda didn't work and continued to tend to her children. She and Abel later asked Joaquin to be Escobar's godfather, to which he said yes. Despite the new job and the promises from Joaquin, the family still struggled to stay afloat. Against Abel's wishes, Hermilda decided to return to work and picked up teaching again. She was sent to the southwestern village of Titirabi, and because it was normal for teachers to live on school grounds, the family uprooted along with her. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, political conflict and civil unrest were rife in Colombia, and the family were endangered on a near-daily basis to the point that they had to go into hiding on several different occasions. Eventually, the family settled somewhat when the education ministry sent Hermilda to Guayabito School, near Rio Negro. A few years later, they moved to Medellín. By this time, they had 4 more children in tow. There were only 2 years between Escobar and his older brother, Roberto. As a result, the siblings had spent much of their childhood together, but their relationship became competitive and difficult around the time that they moved to Medellín and a rivalry began to grow. What had started as harmless bicycle races between 2 brothers had turned into resentment when Escobar began to win every race, even though Roberto trained furiously for each one, and his younger sibling did not. As the discontentment grew between the two, so did the distance between them. They spent less and less time together, and Escobar instead began to bond with his cousin, Gustavo Gaviria. Over the next few years, the family moved several more times before finally settling down in the city of La Paz in the mid-1960s. At their new home, Escobar painted his bedroom a light blue shade and set up a small library using wooden shelves he'd obtained from his father. He carefully arranged his collection of political books, communism texts, and Reader's Digest issues on the shelves, along with a real human skull he'd stolen from a graveyard. In his book, Pablo Escobar, My Father, written by Escobar's only son, Sebastián Marroquín, recalled the time his father told him about this incident, writing that his father said, "One day I decided to challenge my fears, and the best way to do that was to sneak into a cemetery at midnight and steal a skull from a grave. Nobody spotted me, and nothing happened to me. After I cleaned it, I painted it and put it on my desk as a paperweight, Around the age of 15, Escobar began attending Liceo de Antioquia, a high school where he met several new friends. The other boys he bonded with became part of a tight-knit group with him, and they became inseparable. They would spend their weekends cutting their neighbors' grass and camping, and together, they started up their neighborhood Boy Scouts troop. They also loved visiting the cinema, watching James Bond, Mexican films, and westerns. Escobar in particular developed a rebellious streak around this age. Colombia and the world was still very unsettled during this time, and he enjoyed participating in student protests. He told his friends, "I'm going to start a revolution really soon, but it'll be for me." He also noted his distaste for law enforcement, particularly when they impeded protests. He began to throw rocks at passing police cars in his neighborhood and called them fucking pigs. But this was just the beginning of Escobar's relationship with the law. The beginnings of a criminal. Escobar's criminal career began in his teen years. He and his cousin Gustavo stole the keys to their high school staff lounge and used modeling clay to make a mold of the set so that they would have spares. This access to the lounge provided them with numerous things, the first of which was blank diplomas and the school seal, which they were able to replicate. Using these two things, Escobar and Gustavo were able to make fake diplomas for their school. They learned to forge the signatures of professors and imitate their handwriting so that they could write in the grades of their paying customers. Thanks to this endeavor, dozens of students were able to graduate from high school and earn their diplomas without even once setting foot inside the building. The keys they'd obtained also provided the duo with access to the answer sheets to the tests for difficult subjects including maths and various sciences. They began to sell the answer sheets, but this venture was short-lived because school administrators soon became suspicious of the fact that so many students were scoring so highly, so they changed the tests. Although it wasn't much, the money the two boys made from these schemes was enough to motivate Escobar into thinking up more plans that would give him quick and easy money. He and Gustavo began stealing oranges from a local orchard and selling the fruit door to door, and also would purposely bump into fruit stalls on the street and pocket some of the produce that fell, later selling it back to the vendor they'd stolen it from. Escobar, using his charisma, managed to persuade numerous neighborhood children and teens to steal their parents' copies of Reader's Digest for him, so he could add them to his collection without spending a single penny. Eventually, Gustavo and Escobar escalated things by stealing the Cadillac of Medellin's bishop. They hotwired his car and took it for a joyride in numerous nearby villages, abandoning it outside the city when they realized that the police were looking for it. After finishing school, Hermilda persuaded Escobar to take the entrance exam for an accounting program at the Latin American Autonomous University, a Catholic school in Medellin. He passed without exerting much effort but dropped out halfway through the first semester, frustrated by his family's financial issues. He then began spending his time hanging out with his friends at an ice cream parlor, eyeing up young women, although he quickly became annoyed with this too, because men in expensive clothing and flashy cars often showed up to entertain the young women Escobar and his friends wanted to spend time with. The group would often throw rocks at these vehicles and frequently got into fights as a result. In one particular incident, Escobar shot a man in the foot when the man became angry that a young woman didn't want to dance with him. The man reported Escobar and a warrant was issued for his arrest. He did a very brief stint in a local jail before the charges were dropped. Still, Escobar continued with his life of petty crime. He began stealing merchandise from delivery trucks and sold them to local stores. And he and Gustavo also set up a short-lived business in which they sold gravestones stolen from a cemetery by a gravedigger who prepped the stones to look new. However, the duo felt that the profit wasn't high enough and they abandoned this scheme too. It is clear that from an early age, Escobar dreamed of a life of luxury and valued having money above all else. He told his friends around this time, "If I haven't earned 1,000,000 pesos by the time I'm 30, I'll kill myself." His next few ventures with Gustavo involved robbing theater venues at gunpoint and stealing vehicles. Around this time, they were given a temporary contract to issue 3,000 phone books and did so promptly. However, it was soon discovered that they had been so quick because they hadn't checked the addresses. They had also ripped out half the pages of each phone book so they could sell the paper to a recycler. The pair were fired within 2 weeks of starting the job. By all accounts, Escobar had no trouble in his romantic endeavors. He was seen by women as charismatic, attentive, and romantic. In 1973, Escobar, now 24, met 13-year-old Maria Victoria Henao, the daughter of the wealthiest family in La Paz. The two began seeing each other in secret. Unsurprisingly, Maria's family were furious when they discovered her relationship with Escobar, a grown man 11 years her senior. Not only were they upset by the age gap, but they also took an instant disliking to the 24-year-old as he was jobless, a delinquent and a womanizer. Maria's mother, Nora, imposed a curfew on her daughter and stated she could only attend local parties and only in the company of her brothers. However, Escobar was not put off by Nora's attempts to break the pair apart. He continued to see Maria and often gifted her with lavish items such as jewelry and clothing. In late 1974, Escobar was caught driving a stolen vehicle and was booked into La Ladera prison, where he met Alberto Prieto, a man who made an extremely generous income by smuggling contraband into Colombia and who bragged of having friends in high places, including police officers and judges. Escobar was in jail for 2 months, during which he learned all about Prieto's business and how it worked. Prieto took such a liking to Escobar that he made his stolen car vanish from evidence, meaning the case against the 24-year-old was dropped, and he walked out of jail a free man. Just a few weeks later, Prieto also left prison, and he offered Escobar and Gustavo a job smuggling for him. It was around this time that Escobar committed his very first murder. He and Maria's brother Mario agreed to take part in a scam where a man, known as Sanin, would kidnap himself so that his millionaire brother, who was also a smuggler, would pay a ransom. While Escobar went to collect the money, Mario and Sanin stayed at the farm, where Sanin was supposedly kidnapped. However, a neighbor soon called the police to report the odd activity going on, and Sanin told the authorities that he had been abducted by Mario, which landed the latter in prison for 9 months. Escobar, taking this as a betrayal, followed Sanin one night and shot him dead in a garage. Through his work for and relationship with Alberto Prieto, Escobar soon discovered the areas in nearby cities where a paste from Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia could be processed and turned into powder cocaine. And, through Prieto's associates, he learned more about the drug trade. Soon, he and Gustavo took a trip to Ecuador, where they purchased 5 kilos of coca paste. They had their vehicle installed with a hiding place above the gas tank so that they could avoid detection when they returned to Colombia. Back in their home country, their 5 kilos of paste were turned into 1 kilo of powder cocaine, which they sold for $6,000. Finally, after years of scams and schemes that went nowhere, Pablo Escobar had hit the jackpot. The Medellín Cartel. Escobar didn't lag when it came to setting up his new business. He hired Maria's brother, Mario, who still opposed their relationship, to run a kitchen he'd put together on a Colombian farm. And he hid chemical supplies at the La Paz school where one of his sisters worked. Gustavo and Escobar made frequent trips to Ecuador and soon went into partnership with a coca paste distributor named Jorge Galeano, a Colombian native. By 1975, the business was really beginning to take off. Now aged 26, Escobar deposited a check to his bank account worth over $3 million. This same year, he married Maria, who was just 15 at the time, but within weeks he'd begun to indulge in extramarital affairs. He is known to have carried on with TV journalist Virginia Vallejo, who confirmed it in her own 2007 memoir, Loving Pablo, Hating Escobar, and a prominent drug distributor with the Medellín Cartel, Griselda Blanco, also known as Black Widow. The shine soon wore off Escobar's new career, however, when on June 7, 1976, he was called by one of his employees who told him that 2 agents from Colombia's intelligence agency, the Administrative Security Department, which is also known as the DAS, had found the shipment of coca paste they were bringing in by truck from Ecuador. However, the agents had made it clear that they were open to receiving money in exchange for letting the shipment slide. So, at 5 o'clock the following morning, Escobar, along with Mario and Gustavo, went to meet the two men, armed with a $5,000 bribe. However, upon offering the money, the agents announced that all three men, along with the two truck drivers, were under arrest. The group had been set up. The agents weren't interested in money, but in bringing Escobar in front of the judicial system. Following their arrests, the men spent one night in a local holding cell before they were transferred to the Bella Vista prison in North Medellín. Escobar's subsequent mugshot is one of the most recognizable images of him. It shows him grinning, with the prison ID number 128482. But prison, Escobar and his friends soon discovered, was nothing to smile about. Bella Vista had a reputation as one of the country's most violent prisons, where only the most hardened criminals were sent. Added to this was the fact that a rumor circulated in the establishment that Escobar, Mario, and Gustavo were undercover police agents looking for information on the various gangs that ruled it. On one particular occasion, the men were forewarned that an assault had been planned for them in the coming nights. But, fortunately for them, they were saved by another inmate, Jorge Blackie Pabon. It seemed that Escobar's reputation had preceded him, and Pabon was very familiar with Escobar and his business. He put the record straight in the prison, correcting those who still gossiped about whether or not Escobar was an undercover policeman, and quickly became one of his friends and allies. While Pabon had helped smooth things over somewhat, Bella Vista was still a harsh prison, and Escobar and his men struggled inside its walls. He became more frustrated when Maria visited him to let him know she was pregnant with the couple's first baby, and, as a result, he instructed his lawyers to do whatever it took, including bribery, to get himself and his men transferred to another prison. Mario, Gustavo, and Escobar were soon moved to Yaromito, where Escobar escaped, but he soon handed himself in because Maria became upset and didn't want him to go into hiding. Escobar had hoped that the charges laid against him would come to nothing, but the evidence against all of the men involved was overwhelming. Still, his lawyers requested that the trial be moved to Pasto, a city on the Ecuador border, and all three prisoners were moved to Pasto prison as a consequence. Pasto was described as a more pleasant jail. The guards were softer and more susceptible to bribery. Escobar was even allowed to spend weekends at a hotel in town with his wife while he was imprisoned here. But still, the trial was due to go ahead. That is until the two arresting DAIS agents were found dead. Following this, the charges against the group were dropped. In August of 1976, Mario and Gustavo were released. Escobar was given his freedom 3 months later. Although the charges had been dropped, Escobar's name and face had appeared for the first time in police records, and a local newspaper, El Espectador, had caught wind of the story and published an article all about the case. Just the day after his release from prison, Escobar's employees were stopped in the town of La Virginia, having returned from Ecuador after purchasing another supply of coca paste. The police had discovered the secret compartment in the air vent system where they had hidden their cash. But Escobar, despite his recent stint behind bars, was unfazed and undeterred by this incident and promptly went down to the scene with Gustavo in tow. They bribed the police officers and managed to reclaim their vehicle, their supply, and their cash. Soon, using prison contacts, he set up a new routine for gathering the coca paste. A colonel in the Ecuadorian army was hired to lead the project, and, in turn, he made the arrangement between the sellers of the paste in Loja and around a dozen laborers who'd carry up to 20 kilos of the substance hidden in hollowed-out blocks of wood. The laborers would walk for between 15 and 20 hours until they reached the San Miguel River, where Escobar's men waited. Small trucks carried the paste, still inside the blocks, less than 600 miles to kitchens which had been set up on farms in the Colombian countryside. Meanwhile, on February 24, 1977, Maria gave birth to the couple's first son, Juan Pablo Escobar Henao, who later adopted the name Sebastián Marroquín. Escobar's new setup for his drug trafficking business had been done with perfect timing. In the late 70s and early 80s, cocaine became the fashionable drug of choice for many of America's elite, and as a result, demand for the substance skyrocketed in the U.S. The cartel was well and truly taken off, and Escobar organized more smuggling shipments, routes, and distribution networks in Florida, California, and Puerto Rico, among other states and countries. He also developed a new transshipment point in the Bahamas on an island called Norman's Cay, about 220 miles southeast off the Florida coast. Escobar, along with a criminal financier named Robert Vesco, purchased most of the island's land, including an airstrip, harbor, hotel, and numerous houses. They also built a refrigerated warehouse on the island specifically for the cocaine. The business was extremely lucrative, and Escobar was a clever and creative man. He always found ways to smuggle large sums of cash and massive quantities of cocaine. If one route was foiled, he'd figure out another. The United States' lack of security in both airports and harbors also meant that it was still relatively easy to get the drugs into the country. Most of the time, all the cartel needed was a suitcase with a false bottom or crates that were labeled as shipments of bananas. Escobar's limitless inventiveness saw him soaking jeans in liquid cocaine and exporting the garments afterwards. While this wasn't a long-term plan, as the items couldn't be made, shipped, and sold in bulk, the king of cocaine appeared to enjoy the uniqueness of this idea. Buyers would wash the jeans with a special fluid and extract the drug in liquid form before setting them out to dry. This scheme came to an abrupt halt, however, when someone told the U.S. authorities what was going on. In response, Escobar decided to soak the cardboard box the jeans came in cocaine instead. His creativity and generosity helped his name spread beyond the boundaries of the country. Every day, dozens of individuals stopped by his office, looking to do business with Don Pablo. He had safe drug-running routes and offered insurance for shipments. He guaranteed that he would give a full refund of expenses and lost profit if the shipment didn't arrive, all out of his own pocket. He was also known to occasionally give loyal acquaintances and allies the equivalent of between 5 and 10 kilos of cocaine in cash, without the recipient needing to invest or participate in any business ventures. But Escobar was still not a man to be crossed. One day, 2 million pesos vanished from a hidden location in his office. The guard on duty that day quickly came under suspicion, and the money was soon discovered in his house. Escobar had the guard tied up and thrown into the swimming pool at his office, where he was left to drown. He told his employees, who watched on in horror, "I'll kill anyone who steals a peso from me." Pablo Escobar, the property owner. As his wealth grew, Escobar indulged in all sorts of excesses. He rented out entire hotel floors, hosted all-night parties, and bought up aircrafts, vehicles, and property, both for business and personal use. One of the properties he secured was a 6,500 square foot waterfront mansion on North Bay Road in Miami Beach, Florida. The 4-bedroom estate dated back to 1948 and was purchased by Escobar, who paid $700,000 in cash for it. It was later seized by the government during the 1980s and purchased from a private buyer for $9.6 million in 2014 by Christian de Berduar, the owner of the fast food chain Chicken Kitchen. After de Berduar purchased the home, it lay dormant and became prone to break-ins and was once damaged by a fire. Law enforcement officers had warned de Berduar that former allies of Escobar's may return to the property to collect anything the drug lord had left behind. De Berduar hired a documentary film crew and professional treasure hunters to search the house before and after its 2016 demolition, in case there was anything there that belonged to Escobar or the cartel. The team found numerous odd holes in the floors and walls, and also a safe in the floor which was stolen before it could be inspected. Nothing further of value appears to have been discovered. Another home owned by Escobar was an estate on the Caribbean island of Isla Grande. It featured a mansion, apartments, a courtyard, a swimming pool, a helicopter landing pad, reinforced windows, and a large unfinished building to the side. However, it is now half demolished and has been largely reclaimed by the wilderness. Yet another estate he owned was named La Manuela after his daughter. It consists of 20 acres of land and is located in Guatapé, but was at one point destroyed using explosives by another cartel. The remaining carcass is still a lucrative tourist attraction. Escobar's most notable property purchase, however, is Hacienda Nápoles, a luxury estate located in the town of Puerto Triunfo, about 93 miles east of Medellín. The sprawling 7.7 square miles of land includes a collection of old and luxury vehicles and motorbikes, a sculpture park, a personal zoo, a kart racing track, a bull ring, and a private airport. Above the entrance gate was a replica of an aircraft, specifically a Piper PA-18 Super Club mounted on the top. The zoo contained a massive assortment of animals, including exotic birds, antelope, elephants, hippos, giraffes, and ostriches. After his demise, Escobar's family entered into a legal struggle with the Colombian government over the property. The government took ownership of the estate eventually and continues to manage it to this day. Animals from the zoo were shipped to local and worldwide zoos, except for the hippos, who escaped, have since become feral and have bred relentlessly in the decades since Escobar's death. The hippos have become synonymous with Escobar's legacy, and the National Geographic Channel even produced a documentary on the creatures named Cocaine Hippos. Local environmentalists wish to protect the hippos, but they are posing a problem due to the large number of them. Within the next 8 years, it is expected that there will be as many as 400 hippos in the Colombian wilderness, specifically around the Magdalena River Basin area. Scientists have proposed euthanizing some of the hippos, while others have suggested castrating the males so that they cannot continue to breed. The Colombian government declared the hippos an invasive species, and in October 2021, they began to treat the animals with a chemical which will make them infertile. The ruins of the Hacienda Nápoles mansion collapsed in 2015 and were subsequently demolished, but much of the estate is still run as a family-friendly theme park. It now has little connection to Escobar, containing only a small museum about the drug lord and part of his collection of cars. The famous archway with the replica plane mounted on the top was taken down in 2019, further erasing his association with the park. Entering the world of politics. In 1981, Escobar decided that he had more than enough economic power to satisfy him. What he needed now was political power. As he and his family discussed the idea of him entering the world of politics, Maria's mother, Nora, made her stance very clear. She told Escobar, "Pablo, have you forgotten who you are and what you do? If you get involved in politics, there won't be a sewer in the world where you can hide. You're going to put us all in danger. You'll hurt all of our lives. Think about your son, about your family." However, Escobar replied that there was no problem with him getting into politics. He had paid the secret police to make the records of his arrest in 1976 disappear. But his words didn't convince Nora, who continued to oppose his involvement in politics. The majority of his inner circle, however, encouraged the idea that he ran to become a member of the Chamber of Representatives of Colombia, noting that he had a good voter base because of all the things he'd done up and down the country. By this point, he'd used his vast wealth to finance the construction of football fields, basketball and volleyball courts, homes for the poor, cycle tracks, and health clinics. He'd also planted thousands of trees across the city and made charitable donations. Furthermore, for the last year, Escobar had been campaigning against the extradition treaty Colombia now had with the U.S. It had been signed in March of 1979 by Colombian President Julio Turbay. Escobar deemed it humiliating for a country to hand over its citizens to another's judicial system. He decided that this would be his pet cause, and he began to organize meetings which were dubbed the National Forum of Extraditables. Successful businessmen who were actually involved in the criminal underworld were invited to the events, and it became frowned upon to not attend. Here he met the journalist Virginia Vallejo, whom he had an affair with for around 5 years. Soon after he began hosting these meetings, he decided to back the presidential candidacy campaign of Luis Galan of the New Liberals movement. However, like all of Escobar's schemes, his political crusade was tainted with violence. At one of his rallies, which was held during an 8-week campaign, a drunk man shouted, ranted, and pointed at the drug lord, voicing his exhaustion and frustration at the number of politicians who never kept their promises. This greatly angered Escobar. While two policemen escorted the heckler off the scene, they later handed him over to members of the Medellín Cartel, who shot him dead. Escobar's speeches were known for being nationalist in their attitude, and he used simple language and focused on voters from poorer areas. But it wasn't long before problems arose when Luis Galan had the drug lord removed from his rally. Galan wrote him a note explaining, "We cannot tolerate links to people whose activities go against our tenet of restoring Colombia's moral fiber and politics. If you do not accept these conditions, I cannot allow your candidate list to have any ties to my presidential campaign." Escobar wasn't stopped for long, however, and a few days after he severed ties with the New Liberals, he met another politician who belonged to the liberal alternative movement and joined with them instead. The following day, the party ran an ad in the regional newspapers promoting Escobar's candidacy, stating, "We support Pablo Escobar's candidacy for the Chamber of Representatives because his youth, his intelligence, and his love for the most vulnerable make him deserving of the envy of cocktail politicians. He has the support of all the liberals and conservatives in Magdalena Medio, as he has been the savior of this region." In the following months, Escobar discovered that Galan had been made aware of his drug trafficking operation. The informant was a doctor that the 32-year-old had considered a family friend. Much like with Sanin, the kidnap victim, Escobar didn't take the betrayal lightly and had the doctor assassinated. On March 14, 1982, it was announced that Escobar had been elected as a member of the Chamber of Representatives. He was issued a certificate which recognized him as an alternate representative to the House and gave him parliamentary immunity, meaning he couldn't be prosecuted for his crimes. Later that year, on May 30th, Belisario Betancourt of the Conservative Party National Movement was declared the winner of the presidential election. The end of a career. On April 19, 1983, one of Colombia's most influential publications, Semana magazine, published a front-page article about Pablo Escobar, stating, "Who is Don Pablo, the Antiochian Robin Hood who provokes such excitement among hundreds of poor people whose faces reflect a sudden hope, an improbable emotion in this sordid environment?" Just saying his name produces a mix of reactions ranging from explosive joy to deep fear, from great admiration to cautious contempt, but no one is indifferent to the name Pablo Escobar. The magazine mentioned that Escobar had a vast fortune, but it was unknown where he made his money. When he discovered the article, the 34-year-old reportedly stated, "I wish I were Robin Hood, so I could do more for the poor." During this point in his life, Escobar was positively thriving. He was worth millions of dollars. His trafficking business was booming and he had no criminal charges hanging over his head. He'd recently been listed in a survey as one of the world's most recognized figures. Escobar suddenly felt like there was nothing he couldn't accomplish. He wasn't satisfied with having economic and political power anymore. He was driven by something else: revenge. He wanted retribution for how Luis Galan and the New Liberals had treated him. And so, in true Pablo Escobar fashion, he hatched a plan. Escobar had an acquaintance of his pretend to be a businessman who was interested in Galan and the New Liberals, and went to meet with Galan's second-in-command, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla. The acquaintance had been given a tape recorder, and he and Bonilla spoke for over half an hour before parting ways, but not before Bonilla accepted a $1 million check from the acquaintance. Escobar wanted proof that Bonilla had accepted drug money, although one half of the scheme had failed as the acquaintance had failed to set up the tape recorder properly. Later that year, in August, the president appointed Bonilla as his justice minister. Bonilla publicly condemned drug cartels and mentioned Escobar's name, accusing him of laundering money through football clubs. In the last year, the drug lord had opened several new sports establishments. Escobar was, unsurprisingly, furious at Bonilla's accusations, and he and several of his political allies challenged the minister to a debate about dirty money. Escobar had other motives, however. He intended on revealing the existence of the check his acquaintance had given Bonilla, and so, before the debate could begin, he placed a copy of the check on each legislator's desk. Bonilla didn't quibble and admitted he'd taken the money. While the presidential administration scrambled to try and save face, Escobar returned home, only to be told off once again by Nora, who felt that he was bringing trouble to the family's door. He assured her, nothing's going to happen, unaware of what was about to unfold over the next few months. A week after he'd exposed Bonilla for accepting drug money, on August 25th, El Espectador, the same newspaper that had reported on Escobar's arrest in 1976, published a front-page article discussing this same case. While Escobar had had police records about him destroyed, he had failed to do the same to the newspaper's archives. Furious at this turn of events, he began plotting ways to kill the newspaper's editor-in-chief. He also had his men buy up every copy of El Espectador available on newsstands in the streets. But this didn't help the situation, because other papers had already caught wind of Escobar's crimes and began to report on them too. The situation only grew bigger when they learned that the drug lord was trying to silence those who talked about the case. Meanwhile, at home, Maria became pregnant with the couple's second child after 3 miscarriages and 1 ectopic pregnancy. Around this same time, the papers reported on Escobar's infidelity, which caused cracks to appear in the couple's relationship. Maria considered separating from her husband, but he was persistent, and she eventually decided to continue her relationship with him. Things continued to spiral out of control for Escobar when the 10th Superior Judge of Medellín, Gustavo Gaviria, reopened the investigation into the 2 DAS agents who died in 1976, which had allowed Escobar and members of his cartel to walk free from jail. At the same time, the U.S. Embassy canceled his visa, and on October 26th, his parliamentary immunity was revoked. On January 20th, 1984, Escobar resigned from his position as a representative, stating, "I will continue to fight against oligarchies and injustices and against backroom deal-making, which continues to nurture a blatant disregard for the people's needs, and especially against demagogues and dirty politicians who remain indolent in the face of the people's suffering, but are always on the alert when it comes to divvying up official power." His dreams of influencing the country as a politician were now in shambles. So what was next for the king of cocaine? A thirst for revenge. Despite being outed as having accepted dirty money, Bonilla managed to hang on to his governmental position for a time. Undeterred by Escobar's grisly criminal history and reputation for solving every problem with murder, the Justice Minister continued to denounce the illegal drug trade and aimed much of his particularly harsh criticisms at Escobar and his operations. Still frustrated and angry with Bonilla, Escobar sought revenge on the politician, and so he rounded up 6 of his best men and sent them to various locations across the town to keep watch. His men then began tailing Bonilla, learning that he traveled in a non-armored white Mercedes-Benz and was escorted by 2 vans with 4 DAS agents. The cartel also identified the routes on which Bonilla traveled between the Ministry of Justice and his home in Bogotá. Preparing to take Bonilla out, the cartel kitted out a van with bulletproof paneling and painted Red Cross ambulance markings on it to make it look less conspicuous. But over the next few weeks, Escobar's men failed on 3 separate occasions to assassinate the minister, and so he had the van turned into a flower shop delivery vehicle, worried that the ambulance cover had now been blown. On April 30th, 1984, Escobar's men followed Bonilla home in the van, accompanied by 2 more of his men on a motorbike. The plan came to a halt, however, when the van became stuck in traffic and only the motorbike could continue to pursue Bonilla's Mercedes. Still, the 2 men on the motorbike persisted, eventually pulling up alongside the vehicle and opened firing. They successfully assassinated Bonilla in his car. But rather than intimidating the government into silence, all Escobar's plan did was place a target on his back. The Colombian government declared total war on drug traffickers and mafia and cartel leaders, and they especially wanted Escobar. Now 8 months pregnant, Maria fled the country along with her son. The assassination of Bonilla caused many of Colombia's major drug kingpins to flee and go into hiding, including Escobar. He and his family spent a few months in Panama, but his whereabouts were leaked in June of 1984. His newly born daughter, Manuela, was entrusted with a nurse who was escorted by Escobar's best men back to Medellín so she could be cared for by Maria's family, who remained in the city. A month later, newspapers published photos of Escobar with a shipment of cocaine. The images had been taken by a man named Barry Seal, who had betrayed the drug lord by becoming a DEA informant. Escobar returned to Medellín shortly afterwards, but immediately went into hiding. On July 19th, a judge in Florida issued a warrant for his arrest for conspiracy to import cocaine into the U.S. While Escobar's systems were still in place and his name was still infamous, his situation was looking dire, and it grew worse by the day. 10 of his men who were involved in the planning and fulfilling of the assassination of Bonilla were arrested. 6 more had managed to flee and were now in hiding. In December, the first raid was carried out on Escobar's hideout, although he managed to evade capture. In January 1985, 4 of his men were extradited to the U.S. Escobar was so angered by this that he told his men he wanted the president's car blown up. They attempted it 4 times, but failed to successfully kill the president. His drivers changed routes regularly and sometimes didn't even pass where the bomb had been planted. On other occasions, the bomb had failed to detonate. In mid-1985, Escobar had Judge Tulio Castro shot and killed after he served a warrant for his arrest and called him in to stand trial for Bonilla's murder. But this was just the beginning of Escobar's revenge plan. During this time, Escobar became acquainted with one of the leaders of the M19 guerrilla group. Members of the group suggested peacefully occupying a public building and staging a trial for which they'd bring the president to justice for failing to comply with a treaty he'd signed with them. Escobar financially supported this plot, and the group settled on which building to use, agreeing that the Palace of Justice would be the perfect venue. The plan was finally carried out on November 6, 1985. The result was a bloodbath and is still considered one of Colombia's deadliest attacks in its war with the guerrillas of this time. 5 of M19's leaders were killed, along with 12 magistrates. A dozen others were slain or went missing afterwards. Though President Betancourt's administration came to an end in 1986, Escobar still wasn't done with the Colombian government or Betancourt himself, although he was never able to execute the president, despite his many attempts to do so. Barry Seal, the DEA informant who'd taken photos of Escobar sending off a cocaine shipment, was murdered by his men on February 19, 1986. Over the course of the next few months, various political figures who supported extradition and/or the eradication of drug trafficking and cartels were targeted and killed. Escobar began to masquerade as a faceless organization he called the Extraditables and spent time crafting perfectly worded statements that explained his cause. In December of 1986, the Supreme Court of Justice held that the law upholding the 1979 treaty with the U.S. was illegal because it had been signed not by the president, but by the government minister at the time, who'd been carrying out presidential duties. But it was a brief win for Escobar and men like him. The president instead turned to an old treaty with the U.S. that allowed the administration to extradite individuals without judicial approval. El Espectador, the newspaper that had single-handedly ruined Escobar's political career, reported on this story with glee. Its editor-in-chief, Guillermo Cano, moved back to the #1 spot on Escobar's hit list, and he had his men successfully assassinate the journalist. He continued to hate the newspaper so much, however, that he had his men set fire to trucks delivering it and threatened street sellers, effectively ousting the paper from the city of Medellín. But it wasn't over, because soon afterwards, Escobar learned that the Justice Department had obtained several pieces of evidence proving that he was responsible for Cano's murder, and so he had the family's lawyer killed. He also had their family holiday home in the Rosario Islands destroyed, and his men detonated a truck containing 700 pounds of dynamite in a gas station across from the paper's Bogotá offices. Next, Escobar set his sights back on Luis Galan, the presidential candidate who had stopped working with him after learning about his drug trafficking business. An attempt was made on Galan's life on August 4, 1989, but was thwarted by men working for the Colombian National Police. The police commander that was in charge of those same men, Waldemar Quintero, was considered a symbol of fearless incorruptibility at the time. Shortly after this failed assassination attempt, Quintero realized that he would be next. He dismissed his bodyguards, telling them there was no need for them to die too. And within 2 weeks of Galan's attempted assassination, Quintero was murdered by Escobar's men, as was the Medellín mayor, Pedro Pelaez. Shortly afterwards, Galan's staff informed him that Colombian intelligence agencies had learned there was a group of hitmen in Bogotá looking to kill him, and as such, he was advised not to travel to Soacha to give a speech he'd been scheduled for. They suggested he visit another town instead, but Galan changed his mind at the last minute and opted to go to Soacha anyway. On August 18th, he was shot and killed as he walked on stage to give his speech in front of a crowd of 10,000. At least 10 others were wounded in the gunfire. Over the next few years, steeped in anger and a need for retaliation against anyone and everyone who'd betrayed him, wronged him, or even slighted him, Escobar continued to throw Colombia into chaos, leaving death and destruction in his wake. He and his men prepared to go to war with the Colombian government, and the country became known as the world's murder capital. It's been estimated that Escobar was responsible for the deaths of 4,000 people, including 600 police officers after he offered 2 million pesos, less than 500 USD, per kill. At one point, he took down a Colombian airplane with a bomb, killing 107 civilians, and he kidnapped 11 Colombian journalists, killing 2 of them. But as the war raged on, it seemed like nobody was winning. Escobar's hold over the cocaine trafficking business had loosened considerably, and the Colombian government was spending $2 billion a year that they didn't have. Both sides were exhausted by the beginning of the 1990s, and it seemed that there was no end in sight. The end of Escobar. In June of 1991, Escobar surrendered to the Colombian authorities in exchange for leniency, a guarantee of no extradition, and the condition that he could live in his own prison with his own guards. 82-year-old Roman Catholic priest, Father Rafael Garcia Herreros, had helped negotiate his forfeit, and 3 of his men gave themselves up alongside him. Escobar was to be tried under a 9-month-old presidential decree that said he would not be extradited for trial abroad. Escobar's personal prison, La Catedral, was unlike any other prison in the world. It was a former drug rehabilitation center and sat on a mountaintop overlooking the city of Medellín. It was soon dubbed Hotel Escobar and Club Medellín because of how little it resembled regular prisons. Inside, Escobar and his men would hold parties and have fun. It seemed designed to keep his enemies out rather than keep him in as a prisoner. The deal with the government, however, soon fell apart when it was discovered that Escobar had killed several people within the confines of the so-called prison. While they had turned a blind eye to the fact that he was still smuggling cocaine, they were less willing to ignore murder. They decided to move him to a standard prison, but he refused the order, and when men were dispatched to collect him in person, Escobar decided to flee instead. He had served 1 year and 1 month of his sentence when he abandoned the facility on July 22, 1992. After his escape, a 600-man unit was created and specially trained to hunt him down. But over the course of the last 7 years, Escobar's list of enemies had grown exponentially, and a vigilante group known as Los Pepes, short for People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar, made themselves known. Financed by his rivals and former associates, their gruesome style of vengeance allegedly led to the murders of more than 300 of his associates and relatives, among others. 16 months after Escobar's escape from Club Medellín on December 2, 1993, his mobile phone transmissions were traced, and authorities determined that he was hiding in Los Olivos, a neighborhood of Medellín. 8 men raided the house he was trailed to, blowing open the door and pursuing him and a bodyguard as they attempted to escape onto the roof. The men and Escobar engaged in a shootout. He was ultimately shot and killed by Colombian National Police officers as he had his bodyguard try to run across the roofs of adjoining houses. He had been shot in the leg and torso and fatally through the ear. It has never been determined who fired the final shot, but some of Escobar's relatives, including 2 of his brothers, believe he took his own life rather than go to prison. Escobar's reign of terror was finally over. The aftermath. Following his death, the Medellín Cartel fragmented. The cocaine market became dominated by the Cali cartel until the mid-90s, when its leaders were either killed or taken into custody. For many, Escobar's Robin Hood image has remained untarnished. 25,000 people attended his funeral, and some even consider him a saint to whom they pray regularly. But not everyone is a fan of Escobar. When his apartment block in Medellín, the Monaco building, was demolished in 2019, many of the country's politicians and authorities hoped that it would give the city a fresh start. At the demolition, a Vanity Fair reporter was present, and they interviewed numerous individuals who had lived through Pablo Escobar's terrorism and violence. One of them stated, "Pablo Escobar tore this city and country in two. Every night you could hear the bombs and the sirens." This man discussed how in one particular instance he blew up a discotheque, killing 25 teenagers in the process. Today, Medellín is considered a safe and lively city that attracts an abundance of tourists every year and has even won international awards for how it has turned itself around. It is now one of Latin America's leading tech hubs and cultural centers. Mayor Federico Gutierrez in 2019 stated, "I would say to people who want to come to our city, you are welcome, but please respect the story of our victims. They still exist. So much pain still exists." After Escobar's demise, his wife and children fled Colombia. As nowhere would grant them asylum, they escaped to Mozambique before moving to Brazil and then finally settling in Argentina, where Maria became a successful real estate worker until her true identity was discovered. The local media wrote about her story, and she was jailed for 18 months while her finances were investigated until it could be verified that she was not involved in illegal schemes. When it was found that she was not, she was released from prison. She now lives in Buenos Aires with her children under the name Maria Caballero. In 2018, she and her son Sebastian were accused of money laundering with 2 Colombian drug traffickers, and a judge ordered the seizing of assets worth about $1 million each. Escobar's legacy is extremely controversial. Though he built homes for the poor and attempted to make his city a better place with the installation of sports centers and health clinics, he was the very thing that tore it apart and made it worse for every citizen. Driven by revenge, anger, and greed, he waged war with the government. The ensuing madness didn't solely affect him, but members of the entire city and beyond. The likes of Narcos, Netflix's hit show, have brought Escobar's name back into the spotlight in recent years. But for the people of Medellín and Colombia as a whole, it serves as a painful reminder of a history marred with blood, death, and terror.